Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another asynchronous version of Klein Time, where, of course, Klein Time, synchronous or asynchronous, is still your time to shine. Um, so this lesson is going to be kind of interesting because it is the only lesson other than our first lesson in which both my 19th and 20th century history classes have in common, which suggests something about the level of importance I place on the issue and fundamental impact of bias in the presentation of the past, and in particular on the part of professional historians, because these are the folks, as we discussed in our previous class when we were discussing Daniel Boorstin, these are the folks that write the history textbooks that your high school, elementary school, and junior high school teachers relied upon in order to teach you. So their perspectives disproportionately have a greater influence on American society than any non-historian. And I try to illustrate this when I talked about one of the most successful textbook, at least financially speaking, textbook writers of all time, and that being Daniel Boorstin. And what we showed with our discussion of Daniel Boorstin is going to be our first quote of the day. I want to give you two that's going to kind of shape our lesson today. And that is, we run towards our past or away from it. And that is a Dr. Klein original. And one of the things we saw with Daniel Boorstin is that he was attempting to compensate for his past, right? So in order to avoid being accused of being a traitor, what does he do? He writes a bunch of patriotic histories of the United States, so no one can accuse him of being a treasonous communist. I also want to illustrate that to some extent with our discussion of our next historian, Howard Zinn. And I do have a quote of the day that I just want you to put in the back of your mind, because we're going to hear this quote uttered by Howard Zinn himself. And that is, "You can't remain neutral while riding on a moving train." We're going to try to investigate the meaning of that quote, particularly from the point of view of Howard Zinn, because it was indeed a Howard Zinn quote. So I want to introduce you to Howard Zinn. I know I showed you this photo before, and I gave you the extent to which I have a personal history with either of these two gentlemen. I told you about Daniel Boorstin, who had died in 2004. Howard Zinn passed away in 2010, either 2010 or 2011. I got to know Howard Zinn a little bit more, and interestingly enough, Zinn actually came to Westchester Community College back in 1992 to debate one of my former colleagues, Professor Vincent Benelli, on whether or not Christopher Columbus should be seen as a hero or a villain. And by the end of this lesson, I think you will be able to get a very clear sense as to which side Howard Zinn took. I actually did not meet him there. I met him a little bit later on, a couple of years afterward, when he came to visit Hackley School in Tarrytown, where I was teaching. And in fact, I had what I jokingly call, and I emphasize jokingly call, a confrontation with him. But it is something that we are going to discuss to show you how historians can certainly disagree, and how also, just because somebody is a historian and has a PhD doesn't necessarily mean that they cannot make arguments that could be vulnerable to counterattack. And that will be important as well. As a personal side, as a human being, Howard Zinn was always very nice to my students. I had students in the past write to Howard Zinn, and Zinn was nice enough to actually reply to them, which usually very famous and established folks oftentimes don't. Howard Zinn did. Howard Zinn, as I may have mentioned, I'm not sure, kind of became a celebrity of sorts because his own autobiography, which is "You Can't Remain Neutral While Riding on a Moving Train," is actually narrated by the actor Matt Damon, who actually loved Howard Zinn. So let's get a sense to understand who this guy was, and more importantly, and this is the critical point, just like Daniel Boorstin, how his experiences as a young man, and in particular, as we're going to see, his perception of his experiences as a young man are going to greatly influence his influential historical writings later on in life. So let's get started. And let's see. There we go. So, kind of like Daniel Boorstin, Howard Zinn was really the same generation as Boorstin. And what I mean by that is both gentlemen are greatly impacted by the two dominant events of their young adulthood, one of which is the Great Depression, and the other of which is the Second World War. And so let me first talk about Howard Zinn with both of these events. Howard Zinn came from very, very humble roots. He was born to immigrant parents, rather poor immigrant parents in Brooklyn, New York. Today we think of Brooklyn, and so many people think of Brooklyn as, you have to have a lot of money, especially for most neighborhoods, though not all, in Brooklyn, in order to live there. This was not the case in 1922. And that's something to bear in mind. As we learned in the 1930s, the Great Depression had created incredible political instability and economic instability. And one of the reforms that comes out of the Great Depression is that for the first time in American history, unions are legalized. And for my 19th century classes, this is very important to understand, because in the 19th century, unions were not legal in most U.S. states. In other words, that means you could be arrested for joining a union, and you could do a lot of jail time for trying to organize one. And the idea behind a union was that all the workers in one particular workplace would actually negotiate their wages and working conditions as if they were one person. And that's what we do at Westchester Community College. I belong to a union, our union, the WCCFT. Okay, people united can never be defeated. However, in the 1930s, when unions first became legalized, not surprisingly, the management of many of these workplaces didn't like the idea of unions having more power and influence. And Howard Zinn, as a teenager, had gotten a job in the late 1930s working as a dock worker on the docks of Manhattan, loading and unloading cargo. As well as he also had one in Brooklyn as well. And he participated in some of the labor protests. And what management sometimes did was they would actually call up the police to actually put down these protests. And Howard Zinn was going to meet face-to-face with the New York City police. And the first critical, influential event that is going to define his later views was the fact that he was beaten up by a New York City police officer during one of these labor protests. Now, remember how I said that it's important to understand it's not merely what happens to you, but how you perceive what happens to you. And that is that for Howard Zinn, he's not going to think about it as I was beaten up by a New York City police officer, so I don't like cops. What he's basically going to say is the New York City police is an agent of government. The government is assisting the management, the powerful, wealthy management of these companies in order to put down and stop workers from getting fair wages and working conditions. In other words, the police are siding with the oppressor. And the idea that since the police are a representative of government, that means government and wealthy big business are kind of working together to put down the interests of the working class. So as we're going to see, he's going to develop a great deal of sympathy for working class people as a result of this singular experience. Well, his work as a dock worker comes to a rather abrupt end when, on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese government attacks the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. For those of you who ever had to suffer through that awful Ben Affleck movie about the attack on Pearl Harbor, I apologize. And like many of his generation, including my father, he enthusiastically joined the U.S. military. And in particular, Howard Zinn will join the U.S. military to a new wing of the U.S. military, no pun intended, what would later become the U.S. Air Force. At that time, it was called the Air Corps. And he's going to do very well. In fact, he's going to become a decorated bombardier. And in case you're wondering, I usually have some folks who love military history, so I'm going to ingratiate myself to them at this point. The bombardier, so you know what Howard Zinn did, because that would be really important. So Howard Zinn flew on what was called a heavy bomber. That means a plane that dropped lots of bombs. For Zinn, it was going to be against enemy German cities. Basically, he's gonna bomb enemy German cities, and he's gonna be the guy who actually aimed the bombs, targeting the cities. And he did so well that he got lots of medals for it, and that's why that term is called being decorated. Okay, and so he returns from the war, which ends in 1945, as a war hero. But he does something really kind of unusual, and that is that he tossed all of his medals in the East River. And what I want you to think about, and maybe even pause the tape, and of course you can always pause the recording at any time to add important supplemental notes, and already there are a lot of important supplemental notes here, for you guys to write down in addition to what's on the screen. But I want you to think about why he would do that. Pause the tape and then come back. What I'm hoping you'll come up with is that Howard Zinn felt very guilty and ashamed about his performance in the war. Because one of the things I hinted at was when I said that he bombed German cities, that implies that some of the people that were killed by those bombs were civilian population, non-military. And it's important to recognize, and this is very important to recognize, that during World War II, the bombing of civilian population was considered a legitimate war tactic. And in fact, every single warring country bombed civilian population. It was rooted in the belief, and this was the belief at the time, it was rooted in the belief during World War II that the civilian population of the enemy represented the weakest link of the enemy. So if you can terrify the civilian population, then the civilian population would then turn to its government and say, oh, please surrender, we don't want to be bombed anymore. Now, what's interesting is that if you analyze World War II, the exact opposite happened. When civilian population was bombed, instead of destroying the morale of the enemy, it only emboldened the morale of the enemy. And the way you guys can think about it is, in the aftermath of the attacks of 9/11, the American people did not turn around and say, oh my God, we just lost 3,000 lives in this awful terrorist attack. Let's surrender to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Right? In other words, we became more patriotic, more resolute. Okay? But know that at the time, that was the belief. Now remember something that is critical here. And this is very important to understand when we talk about the impact that people's personal history have on them. And that is, it's not always what happened that mattered, but rather what people perceived as to what happened. Let me give you an example. If any of you know any identical twins, when I was a kid, there was these identical twins that I knew, John and Ron. And here was the deal. John and Ron were identical twins, and their parents believed in kind of a hands-off philosophy when it came to child rearing. So basically, they would let John and Ron just, go out on their own as young kids and kind of, find their own way. And for John, he concluded that that was a great thing because it allowed him to investigate nature on his own, and as a result, he became really interested in science and scientific phenomenon, and today he is a very successful doctor. And he was very thankful for his parents giving him that independence and autonomy. Contrast that with Ron. Ron had the exact same experience. In other words, he was allowed to do his thing. But Ron, on the other hand, interpreted what his parents were doing very differently. He perceived them as as ones who were abandoning him. And as a result, to fill that void, what he felt was that void in his life of being abandoned by his parents, he turned to drugs and ended up dying in prison. Now note something very important. Both individuals had the same child rearing. In other words, you can't just say they were products of their past, because how do we explain why John succeeded and yet Ron failed? And the answer, and this is really important for us to understand as we're going to apply momentarily with Howard Zinn, is not so much what happened to them, but how they interpret it, how they perceived it. And let me give you a great example with Howard Zinn to demonstrate to the idea that even though Howard Zinn felt very guilty about what he did, that didn't mean that other veterans of World War II felt guilty about this, even those that did the exact same thing. So let me give you an example. And by the way, for those of you who are like, wow, Dr. Klein, from my 19th century class, you're probably saying, wow, Dr. Klein, I didn't realize we'd be doing a lot of 20th century history. I know my 20th century students are like, this is like too awesome, Dr. Klein. It's like a double bonus. But actually, for my 19th century students, it's equally as important, because oftentimes our views of previous centuries are shaped by the way we perceive what happened in our own centuries. And 19th century people just wait. I have a great example of that a little bit later on with a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner. We'll get to him a little bit later. 20th century people, sorry, you're not going to be so lucky. So, let me take you back. I'm going to take you back to what we did on the first day. Remember I told you about my travels? So I'm going to go back to the trip to Amsterdam. Why not? It'll be a special bonus for us. So let's see what we have here. Where are you? And okay, there we go. Oh, that should be yeah. We'll get back to that very important slide. But there's Howard Zinn as a war hero. Okie dokie. Just a reminder, just a little map for you. This so you just get a sense of where everything is. There's Amsterdam. It is in the Netherlands, otherwise known as Holland. And there are the neighboring countries, Belgium. Remember I talked about when I stayed in Belgium for those World War I battles and those two men dragging the cross along the road. This is Germany, and this is Denmark. And I wanted to learn more about the impact of World War II on Holland, and I learned a lot from this man. Oh, there's me there's me in Amsterdam. Oh, I forgot about that. I learned a lot from. Oh, by the way, this is considered like the Times Square of Amsterdam. It's called Dam Square, D-A-M. Everybody goes there. This is, in my opinion, humble opinion, the best local historian of the history of Amsterdam as well as Dutch history. His name is Peter Schaap. I think it's S-C-H-A-A-P. So if you're ever in Amsterdam, you have to sign up for one of his tours. They are absolutely incredible. So let me give you the deal with Peter. I signed up for his World War II tour because I had learned that Nazi Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, in 1940 conquered all of the Netherlands, including Amsterdam. And in fact, they did it, so you know, in less than a week. It was very, very quick. And what Peter was going to tell us about is like what happened in Amsterdam during the war. He told us about the experience of one teenage girl, Anne Frank, if you ever read the Diary of Anne Frank. And then he was going to then talk about how Holland got liberated by a combination of the efforts of the Americans, the British, and the Canadians. Before he started talking about it, he said to us, he said, I've got a really, really interesting story. He said, to tell you. And he was, and we were like, ooh, what would you like to tell us? And he said, well, check this out. I was starting to talk about the military operations that helped liberate Holland. And for those like folks who are like love military historians, you kind of need a battle map, okay? And so he showed us like a battle map, kind of like this one, to show how the good guys. This is the American Ninth Army. This is the British First. This is the British First and Second Army. This is the part of this is here the Canadian troops within the British Army. How there were these two major operations, Operation Grenade and Operation Veritable, which were fought in 1945, which helped liberate much of Holland from Nazi rule. And then he told us as soon as he mentioned Operation Veritable, one of the people in the tour group from a couple of weeks back said to him, hey, Peter, there's something I got to tell you. He said, my grandfather, he was a British guy, said, my grandfather, who just passed away recently, fought in that battle. And specifically, he fought at the northernmost wing of the operation, Cleve, which is a small town in Germany right on the border of Holland. And Peter was like, whoa, can you tell us, like, what did your grandfather do? And the guy told Peter this really interesting story, and this is what really matters for us, okay? He said that right before his grandfather died, his grandfather, who had served in the British Air Force, it was called the Royal Air Force, or the RAF, he was on a heavy bomber, just like Howard Zinn. He was a flight engineer on it, but he was in the bomber. So he did kind of like what Howard Zinn's crew did, okay? He said to his grandson, I want to give you my most prized possession. And it's like, well, what was the grandfather's most prized possession? I know it's very difficult to see because it's very black, but I think you guys can see it pretty clearly on the screen here. It was his grandfather's logbook. You see flying logbook? That's where you kept a record of all of the missions that you flew. And the grandfather said, I want you to have this, my most prized possession, my grandson, because this, I believe, was my proudest moment and my greatest achievement in life. And so Peter was like, whoa. And then he took out the flight book and he showed him. And lo and behold, the grandson was absolutely right. Check this out, gang. This is his last name was Jackson, right? And so Flight Officer Jackson, okay, he was flight engineer. And just a quick interpretation. So Europeans like to put the days before the months, and then comes the year, and they deal in military time. So February 1st, 1945, 1600 hour, that's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They flew a bombing mission. OPS stands for operations, over the German city of Mannheim. And you can even see, by the way, what they dropped. Here they dropped this single plane dropped one 4,000 pound bomb, in addition to a host of other bombs. Okay. Um, and then if you kind of scroll down just a little bit, you'll see right here, 7/2, February 7th, 1945. 1915, so that's 7:15 at night, so it's a night bombing, okay? And it says Ops Cleve, okay? And you can see here it gives even more of a description. They dropped a 4,000-pound bomb and 16 500-pound HEs. That stands for high explosives. And if you take a look closely, it even says why they were doing this. This was to support the Canadian Army. So what the idea was that you bomb Cleve, right, in advance, like first. That kind of softens everybody up, and then the Canadian Army, the ground forces, come in. And if you look, they were coming in at 4,800 feet. That means the altitude. And that should tell you something right there. They're coming in very, very low. By the way, if you want to pause the tape, you can pause it right now and take a guess. Why would they be coming in very, very low? I gave you a hint when I described this particular mission. If you said they were bombing at night, that was the key. So they're coming in low. They want to be able to see the target better because it's going to be pretty dark, right? So, my guess is you probably want to see what happened to Cleve after this squadron bombed it. And so they basically blew Cleve off the face of the earth. Cleve was just simply destroyed by the bombings, and this is where you can get a sense of that, right? Well, Peter was really intrigued by this, and so he decided to take a trip to Cleve to see if there's any remaining history about the operation that he could learn about. And so he went to the local cemetery in Cleve, and he came across this gravestone. Maria Thyssen, born February 19th, 1943, died February 7th, 1945. Oh, wait a minute. Hold on, gang. February 7th, 1945. Ops Cleve. Hey, gang, there's a very good chance that this little girl died in the bombing. Okay. Now, for somebody like Howard Zinn, he would consider this murder. But for Flight Officer Jackson, remember what he told his grandson, that this was his proudest moment. Now, it doesn't mean that he was very happy that he killed a 2-year-old little girl, but his perception was that he was helping to liberate the modern world from the evils of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. So he basically did the same thing that Zinn did, but because he had a different perception of what he did, as a result, his larger views about patriotism, for example, are going to be very different, as we'll see, than Howard Zinn's. So ultimately, for Howard Zinn, much like what happened to him in the United States during the Great Depression, he's going to come to view the U.S. government as not only a force for evil at home, but a force for evil abroad. Bear in mind, Zinn was, 18, 19 years old when he joined the war effort. And nothing against my 18 or 19-year-old, 20-year-old students, but, he was young, innocent, and naive in his view, and he he felt that he had been used as a tool to harm innocent people and felt incredibly guilty. And much like what Daniel Boorstin is going to do, he is going to try to somehow use his writings as a professional historian when he comes back from the war and gets his doctorate in history, in his not only in his historical writings, but in his conduct. Because the thing that you're going to see from Howard Zinn is, for the rest of his life, he is going to see and act as an advocate for the oppressed and the vulnerable. And as you write this down, in case you're wondering, Dr. Klein, how do you know that these experiences, or more importantly, his perception of these experiences, influenced his later views so much? That's pretty easy, because he tells us that. Before Howard Zinn passed away, he was basically an open book in terms of not only what influenced his points of view, but he had some very definitive viewpoints on how history should be taught, and he also had some very definitive viewpoints on his perspective of the American past. And just before I play this for you, just put your guess, plus or minus. Do you think Zinn is going to take a positive view of America's past, or a negative one? Let's see if you're right. Now, understand that as I try to figure this out. Okay, stand. So I'm going to actually start a little bit earlier on this tape. I know I put in that to start at 3 minutes 45 seconds. For those of you who, if they have any technical glitch, I put up the YouTube link. I'm going to start it at 2:40, and we're going to get a sense of this. If you have any problems with any of the audio, I'm hoping that it works. If not, you could just watch it. We're going to watch it for about 4 or 5 minutes. I'm going to interrupt along the way to tell you a couple of things. So here we go.
People were remembering the kind of history they had learned in high school and college, and was thinking, this doesn't fit what I see in the world today. And so they were looking for something, and so I decided to write something to fill that need. Now, clearly, those of you who know the book I know that I came to that history from a very definite point of view. And I guess this is because when I began to study history, when I decided that's what I would do, I would write history and I would teach history, I already knew that I was not going to be a neutral teacher. I was not going to be a neutral historian. I have a memoir called, notice how I'm advertising all my books. Isn't this a book festival? You know? Yeah, I have many more. You'll hear many more things like that. And I'll just try not to mention other people's books. But I wrote a memoir called "You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train," and the idea of it came from things I would say to my classes at the beginning of the class. I would say, "Now look, this is not going to be a neutral class. This is not going to be one of those classes where you spend a semester or a year with a teacher, and at the end of the semester, at the end of the year, you have no idea where this teacher stands on the important issues of the day." We've all had teachers like that, right? There are a lot of them. No, I wasn't going to be neutral. I had a point of view, a strong point of view.
So the first thing that you should notice right away is that in some ways he's criticizing folks like me, with notable exceptions, but the idea being that, as we're going to see in this class, and I kind of hinted at it already when I talked about, for my 19th century class, the different views of Nathan Bedford Forrest, the different view for my 20th century class, the different views of Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson, that I try to have some kind of balance, right? And by the way, that at my school, that's seen as a positive thing, right? Notice Howard Zinn is saying something very, very, very different, okay? Let's see why he believes that one shouldn't attempt to be balanced or neutral. Okay, here we go.
And I wasn't going to hold back on it because I didn't believe well, you might say I had a very modest desire in going into history. I just wanted to change the world.
Now we're seeing something really important, aren't we? Notice that Zinn recognizes, much like the way Borston recognized, that he could influence society's perspectives of themselves and where they want to go in the future by influencing society's perspectives of the past. That is, by the way, one of the main reasons why Zinn is going to write a book called A People's History of the United States. Notice he didn't say, I want to change the world, so I want to become a politician. Okay? He said, I want to change the world, so I'm going to become a historian. Okay? Let's listen in.
And I figured you can't change the world if you're neutral. And besides, to be neutral, no. The world is already moving in certain directions. There's no real thing, neutrality. It doesn't exist. The world is already moving in certain directions. Wars are going on. Children are going hungry. Terrible things are being done. To be neutral in such a world is to collaborate with what is going on.
So now we understand why he's talking about and criticizing the more neutral or the more balanced historians. Because what he's saying is, now you're no longer part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Okay?
And so, no, I wasn't going to be neutral as a historian. And yes, I kind of knew as I started to write this book what my point of view
here we go.
Was going to be. And it came out of my background. It came out of my life experience. It came out of the fact that at the age of 18, I didn't go to college. I went to work in a shipyard. Stayed in the shipyard for 3 years. I didn't do it as a sociological experiment. Let's go interview the shipyard workers and do an oral history of shipyard workers. Yeah, no, that wasn't it. I just came from that kind of background, that kind of family, that kind of neighborhood, and working class parents and so on, struggling, no thought of going to college when you got to 18. Everybody around me went to work at the age of 18. So I worked in a shipyard for 3 years and helped organize the young shipyard workers who were excluded from the AFL unions. Black people were excluded from the unions. Women were excluded from the unions. Unskilled workers were and so we formed a kind of industrial union, an IWW, almost. That's what we like to think, Whenever we just...
So, a couple of things. We have it right here. Here's some great evidence to show, hey, Zinn is saying, look, my experience as a young shipyard worker, especially trying to organize people in the union, and something that I didn't mention before, but I'll mention now, is that one of the things you should know about labor unions, especially in the first half of the 20th century and even in the middle of the 20th century, and some have argued, by the way, even up to this day, is that a number of labor unions practiced racial and gender discrimination. And as you could see, Zinn, even at a young age, is organizing workers, especially those from groups that had been traditionally discriminated against.
Something good we like to compare ourselves to the IWW, you see. And we were...
the IWW stands for the International Workers of the World. The Industrial Workers of the World. So there was an attempt to organize industrial workers, not as well as skilled workers.
You might say I grew up class conscious, with a phrase you don't hear much in the United States. You know, that is, we're not supposed to have classes in the United States. We're all one big happy family, you see. All of our interests are the same. You know, Exxon and me. The founding fathers and all of us. The very, name founding fathers, we're related by blood to those slave owners who sat in on the making of the Constitution.
Okay, so first, what do you get a sense there? Notice how he talks about the founders of this country, people like George Washington. He's going to argue the great men weren't so great.
We're not one big family, despite the attempts on the part of the establishment to draw us all in to this net and say our interests are one. You hear them talking about, is this in our national interest? Is this in the interest of national security? Actually, it may be in the interest of somebody's securities, but not in the interest of national security, you see. But all these phrases are supposed to envelop us all in one common bond of interest, and thus hiding the fact that we are a society of many different interests, of people who are rich and people who are poor, and a lot of people in between who are nervous.
Wow. Okay. So, if you listen to Zinn carefully, you may have hearkened back to the prologue of Daniel Boorstin from his U.S. history book. Remember how he wrote about how did Americans become one big family? So in many ways, Zinn is attacking that narrative, that interpretation of America's past. Okay? And what is important to understand with what he's doing here is that he is trying to explain not only what he believes, but how his personal experiences, in this case he was talking about his labor union experience, influenced what he believed as well. And by the way, so you know, he'll also talk in other interviews about his military experience in World War II, and all of that added up to him seeing himself as using history as a tool to promote social change, okay? Especially social change that would help the vulnerable and the oppressed. Now, I had mentioned that Zinn not only wrote historically, and we'll be going over one of his writings that I have placed in the very important documents folder on Blackboard, but not only did his writings going to echo these sentiments, but even his actions will do so. And we kind of see that just by looking at his professional career. So he gets his PhD in history, just like Dr. Klein would later do. That's why I'm a doctor. In the 1950s, and he gets hired to teach history at Spelman College in Georgia. And for those of you who don't know, Spelman College is an HSBC. It's a historically black college, and by the way, it's also an all-female college. And after teaching there for a couple of years, he gets fired from Spelman. And for those of you who are thinking, oh my God, Dr. Klein, what did he get fired for? Like, for example, did he say something racist or sexist to one of his students? The answer is absolutely not. Quite to the contrary. Let me give you a sense of why he got fired. As you can see from these photos, or at least some of these photos and some of the quotes, Howard Zinn was actually fired for being too supportive of the civil rights movement for black people. Now, you might think that's kind of nuts. Why would you be fired for being supportive of civil rights? It is because Zinn would go into his class and he would basically tell his students, he'd say, hello, ladies, today I'm going to teach you how, because of the color of your skin and your gender, your ancestors have been oppressed in this country for the last 400 years. But then I'm also going to tell you we don't have to accept that. So I want you to join me in a civil rights protest right after class on the streets of Atlanta, Georgia. And you've got to remember, he is saying this in the late 50s and early 1960s. This is a time period, particularly in the South, where you could get killed very, very quickly and very, very easily for protesting for civil rights. John Lewis was nearly murdered by an Alabama policeman in one of his marches, right? So bear in mind that this was very dangerous. And so what the administration, even though the administration agreed with his general ideas, the black administration of Spelman College was concerned that the school would get firebombed by the Ku Klux Klan. And so they fired him. But his impact on many of his students would remain for decades later. Because he would teach them things, as this quote above lists, there's no act too small, no act too bold. The history of social change is the history of millions of actions, small and large. In other words, do the little things. Everybody has a role to play. Coming together at points in history and creating a power that governments cannot suppress. And one of his students was the author of the book The Color Purple, which was later made into a movie, Alice Walker. And she even writes, and I quoted from her, I was Howard's student for only a semester, but in fact I have learned from him all my life. His way with resistance, steady and persistent, impersonal with humor, is a teaching I cherish. And look what she writes. Whenever I've been arrested, I've thought of him. So this is somebody who not only talked the talk, but he walked the walk. By the way, as a very interesting aside, decades later, about 40 years later, I think in the early 2000s, Spelman College invites Howard Zinn back to the school. He would go up to Boston University and teach there. In fact, he taught one of my colleagues at Boston University, Professor Courage. He would go to Boston University and teach there, and he was invited back to Spelman College to give their graduation address. And it was at that point that the new president of Spelman College issued Howard Zinn a formal and public apology for firing him. And so one of the interesting questions that you can think about and maybe kind of put your opinion down is, if you were the president of Spelman College, would you have fired Howard Zinn back in 1963? What reasons for doing so? What would have said, no, I shouldn't do that? Just an interesting thought, right? And we now are going to be able to understand and see his bias in action. His very, very famous book was called The People's History of the United States. In fact, there are many editions of this book. Remember how we talked about what should we teach the elementary school kids? There's actually a quote-unquote young people's edition of A People's History of the United States. Right? You can think about would Howard Zinn have taught about those various negative episodes in Westchester history that we talked about in class, right? And suffice it to say, it's safe to say Howard Zinn would say, absolutely. So a couple of loose ends with that. Remember I said I am going to mention to you my personal dealings with Howard Zinn. He had a debate at Westchester Community College, which I actually have the video of, but the problem is it's in such an old format that it barely plays, so I need to kind of get it repaired. But he debated Vincent Benelli, who was a history professor who passed away a couple of years ago, Christopher Columbus, hero or villain. And it was very interesting what Howard Zinn said in the debate. One of the things he noted was that he believed that in discussing the history of the United States, the single most influential event was Christopher Columbus's voyages. You might think, but wait a minute, Christopher Columbus never set foot in the continental United States. True, but for Howard Zinn, he viewed not only Columbus as a villain, but that Columbus was a precedent setter, a pattern setter of oppression in the New World. So Columbus would enslave some of the indigenous peoples of the island of Hispaniola, which is now the modern-day Haiti and Dominican Republic. And so he kind of got the ball rolling. And so he would say in the debate, he said, this is no longer about 1492. This is about 1992, because the same style of oppression that happened then is happening today. The names may change, the groups may change, but the dynamic remains the same. And you can learn a lot. Some students have told me, Dr. Klein, I read A People's History of the United States. But many students said, I never read the book. But even in not reading the book, you can kind of tell, just by looking at some of the titles of his works, where Howard Zinn stands. A People's History of the United States. Okay? So if you think about it, do you think Howard Zinn is going to have a lot of chapters on the accomplishment of famous people, like George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or Franklin Roosevelt or John F. Kennedy or Ronald Reagan? No. He's going to teach what he called history from below, meaning how did ordinary Americans, people like Dr. Klein's great-grandmother who came to this country at age 15 with nothing, Native Americans, the indigenous peoples, enslaved Americans, how did they experience America? That's what's going to be his point of view. Okay? And I also want to give you a sense of how he viewed America's role in the world. And I want to read to you from an article that he wrote in 2006, only a couple of years before he passed away. And you can see this article in the very important documents folder on Blackboard. He writes this article called Put Away the Flags on the 4th of July weekend. Now understand something, the 4th of July weekend, of course, as we all know, is the most patriotic of all holidays. It's the one where people are most likely to take out the American flag, chant USA, etc. Listen to what Howard Zinn thinks about this holiday. Okay? And I want to read excerpts for you, and you can, if you'd like, go to Blackboard and you could kind of read along, but you'll get a sense of where he's coming from. He says, on this 4th of July, we would do well to renounce nationalism. Let's forget nationalism, patriotism, and all of its symbols, its flags, its pledges of allegiance, its anthems, and its insistence in a song that God must single out America to be blessed, the song God Bless America. Because isn't nationalism and patriotism's, that devotion to the flag, one of the great evils of our time, along with racism and religious hatred? Because then he says, these ways of thinking, referring to patriotism, cultivated and nurtured and indoctrinated from childhood on, see, he's talking about the way history is being taught, have been very useful to those in power, but deadly for those out of power. And then if you skip down to the middle of the page, it says, our citizenry has been brought up to see our nation as different from others, as an exception in the world, as being uniquely moral, expanding into other lands in order to bring civilization, liberty, and democracy. But this is a self-deception that started early. In other words, we have been taught a view of America that makes the American past seem glorious and pristine, and this, in his view, is wrong, not only wrong, but has had many damaging effects in the present. Okay? And then what he does is, for the rest of the article, he goes through a bunch of historic events where the United States and even the colonial United States has engaged those from the outside world, and collectively they were all bad for the United States. In other words, the United States acted as an oppressor. He talks about the Puritans, and Zinn is one of the people who believe that Thanksgiving should be renamed Native American Oppression Day. On the last page, he talks about his interpretation of World War II. Remember, the war that he himself was a war hero from. He says, one of our effects of our nationalistic, patriotic type of thinking is a loss of a sense of proportion. The killing of 2,300 people at Pearl Harbor became the justification for killing 240,000 in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. The killing of 3,000 people on September the 11th became the justification for killing tens of thousands of people in Afghanistan and Iraq. And then he says, we need to refute the idea, in other words, dismiss the idea that our nation is morally superior to the other imperial powers of world history. An imperial power, a country that gets its power through conquest. We need to assert our allegiance to the human race and not to any one nation. Now, bear in mind a couple of things. I usually will conduct a poll in my class saying, how many of you are thinking to yourselves, man, Howard Zinn, I really like this guy. I like what I'm hearing. And about half my class will raise their hands and say, oh yes, I'm really into this guy. And then I said, how many of you can't stand this guy? And the other half would raise their hands. Howard Zinn is a polarizing figure. In other words, he is someone, as a historian, who really people either loved or hated. There was no one in between. Maybe you know somebody like that. Maybe you are that person. And it's important to understand that his views are considered very controversial. Not surprisingly, one of the chief criticisms of his views is that he is not patriotic enough, that he is far too negative. In fact, those who really hate him simply call him un-American. I remember when he gave a talk, I I forgot where, but I watched it, and there was a question from the audience. The guy said to Howard Zinn, he said, "Why don't you go back to the country that you came from?" And Zinn says, "I'm from Brooklyn." You know, in other words, he is criticized for being a sort of a national self-hater, and that's very big. That's going to be the number one thing that is used against him. But then again, and I will tell you, just because he was a history professor, and just like Daniel Boorstin was a history professor, doesn't mean that we have to agree with all of his arguments. And that brings me to my own personal story with Howard Zinn. And that is, in the late 1990s, he came to speak at Hackley School, a very elite, very expensive high school that didn't pay me a dime when I was a teacher there. But in any event, he came to speak, and at the time I was teaching a course called War and Society, and he came to speak on a topic on the history of America's role in the world. And what he argued was that America should practice a policy of pacifism. Pacifism. Think of the word Pacific, like the Pacific Ocean, and put an ISM at the end of it. If you are a pacifist, that means you believe that countries should not use war as a tool of policy under any circumstances, with the exception of actual invasion by the enemy. Okay? Possibly. There are some who don't even believe in that. So, when Zinn said that, we went to the question and answer session, and I, of course, had to ask him the obvious boilerplate question, that means the one that everybody's expecting, which was, Professor Zinn, as many of us know, you were a war hero from World War II, and which helped stop Nazi Germany from conquering the world. If you do not believe that war should be used as a tool of policy, then how should the United States and other countries have stopped Adolf Hitler from conquering the world? And this is what he said. He said what the United States and other countries should have done was they should have had international broadcasts to the German people, encouraging the German workers, especially those who worked in the war industries, like making guns and stuff, to go on strike. Yeah, to go on strike, so that if they went on strike, if they refused to work, then the German military wouldn't have any guns, and then they couldn't invade anybody. And I would often ask my class, what do you think of Zinn's strategy there? And what you can do is you can even take a minute and pause the tape and just think in your mind, what possible counter arguments could you make to this strategy? Can you identify a potential weakness or two? Right. So, if you did pause the tape, welcome back. Well, one of the things you have to understand is that Germany was a totalitarian country, a totalitarian dictatorship. That means that the Nazi government under Adolf Hitler completely dominated both your public and private life. So if you decided to organize a group of ammunition workers to go on strike, you could be rest assured that the Nazi secret police, the Gestapo, would be paying you a visit, and you would probably be ending up in a concentration camp. So one would say that it wasn't really realistic to think that this would be a viable option. Students in the past have also pointed out something very important, which is absolutely true. Zinn's claim is based on the assumption that the German people would even agree to do such a thing. Because bear in mind, especially as we move into the late 1930s, Adolf Hitler was a very popular figure in Germany. See, in the early 30s, he wasn't, but his popularity grows, so much so that by the late 1930s, even if there was a free and fair democratic election in Germany, Adolf Hitler would have been elected. So that suggests something to you. Just because somebody in authority has an argument doesn't mean that they cannot be vulnerable to a counter argument. So never be intimidated by that. Very, very, very important. And there's also something else that's very important to understand when we look at both Daniel Borston's view and Howard Zinn's view. And if I've said it before, it is worth reiterating. I'll give you a bonus quote of the day, which is, when you read a source, know the source. When you read a source, know the source. When you read a source, know the source. Because too often, students will be assigned a reading in a textbook, and they'll say one of the most painful things that I've ever heard, which is, the book said this. And I always have to remind students, the book didn't say a damn thing. Okay? It's not the book that talks. It's the author that talks. That's why I always say, Zinn argues this. Lowen argues that. Marchant argues this. Borston argues that. Okay? People make arguments. So just because it's in a book and the book says it, doesn't mean it's necessarily a valid claim, but also bear in mind, even if it is, you should appreciate that bias might be operating in the minds of these historians. And while bias does not disqualify the merits of somebody's argument, right? I am a Mets fan, and I can make the argument that Jacob deGrom has been the best pitcher in the major leagues over the last 3 years. That claim might have a lot of merit. I can show you statistical evidence that could lead one to make that very reasonable conclusion. But you also need to recognize that it shouldn't come as a surprise to you that I think Jacob deGrom is the best pitcher in the baseball, because Jacob deGrom plays for the Mets, and the Mets are my favorite team. And this leads me to my last point. And so you know, or my last point of this lesson, so you know, you're probably wondering, Dr. Klein, you haven't given any magic numbers yet. That's right, gang. I decided to kind of test you out. Indeed, I would like to give you some magic numbers. So the first magic number, I'm going to give you 3. The first magic number is 8. 8 is the first magic number. The number 8 is the first magic number. 8. So, if I'm biased about baseball, am I biased in my analysis of the past? Or is somehow Dr. Klein so gifted and talented that he could rise above not only his personal experience and personal past, but also from his perceptions of his personal past? Am I? You bet I'm biased. And I want to share that with you right now in discussing my views of Donald Trump. Let me give you a sense of this. But before I do, let me give you the second magic number. The second magic number is the number 24. The second magic number is 24. Okay, 24 is the second magic number. Donald Trump. My hatred of Donald Trump is visceral. I don't think for me it's possible it is possible, let me put it this way, but I don't think, Donald Trump is in a very small group of elite company of modern day figures who I just simply despise. And if you'd notice the venom with which I speak, it's almost as if, I'm sure you're probably thinking to yourself, gee, God, it's almost as if Dr. Klein somehow knew Donald Trump. Well, guess what, gang? Do I have something to show you? Because the answer is kind of. So here I am at the Philadelphia Constitution Center, actually called the Constitution Center in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, one of the best museums on the planet. I would encourage you all to go. And I was there in late 2016, and they had just put up in the kind of the gallery of the presidents, a portrait of Donald Trump. And as you can see, when I said my hatred is visceral, I meant it was and is visceral. And as you can see, I am pointing to the painting with my middle finger. Okay, so I make it very, very clear that if I were to write a book about Donald Trump, I'm not going to write a lot of positive things, if any, right? And you might be wondering, gee, Dr. Klein, what's your deal with Donald Trump? Well, here's what I need to say to you. Before he became president, before he put forth his various political views, forgetting any of that, I hated the man because he tried to ruin the career of one of my dearest friends, my friend Eric. Okay? And in fact, he's one of those people, we all have one in our lives, and hopefully more than one, the all-around nice person. That person that really you'd have to be a real bastard to hate. That's my friend Eric. What a nice guy. And basically, my friend Eric used to work as a newspaper reporter for the New York Times. And in the early 2000s, when Donald Trump was going around bragging about how rich he was, Eric and some of his reporter colleagues did some digging into Donald Trump's financial background, and they found out, far from Donald Trump being a billionaire whose casinos, especially in Atlantic City, had made lots of money, that Donald Trump was actually on the verge of bankruptcy. And they wrote that. And by the way, they turned out to be absolutely correct. However, because Donald Trump didn't like what that did to his reputation, he decided to sue not only the New York Times but Eric personally. Okay, and at the time Eric wrote this article, he was in his early 20s. Okay. And he did it not because Trump thought he was right. He knew he was wrong. He knew Eric was writing the truth. He did it as a bullying tactic. And if you've ever been sued or ever had to deal with anything with court, even if you're totally innocent, right, it could be an arduous and costly process. Eric was lucky that it didn't cost him financially, but it cost him in terms of his time, because the case lasted 9 years. And Eric actually won the case. Okay. As an aside, if you're wondering how did he win the case, Well, when Trump had to give his witness testimony and was asked, how did you come up with your estimate that you were a billionaire? Trump says, I estimate my wealth based on my mood at the time. Hey class, I feel like $1 million doesn't mean I have $1 million. And so Eric is going to win the case. But I remember watching what he went through and the psychological effect it can have, So my hatred of him goes back long before this. And that leads me to a really interesting episode in my own life where all of this comes together, and to show you how bias can operate even in a kind of tricky way. In 2019, was it 2019? Yes. Was it? Yeah, it was either 2018 or 2019. No, it was 2019. In 2019, Donald Trump was due to give the State of the Union address. And on that day, before he gave his address, our former head of public relations storms into my classroom and says, Professor Klein, we need a favor from you. News 12 Westchester needs a political expert to be their analyst for Donald Trump's State of the Union address because their regular analyst is sick. Can you do it tonight? And so, lo and behold, I said, sure. And indeed, I appeared on News 12 for the State of the Union address. When right before I appeared, the same PR guy said, now, Professor Klein, you know that Donald Trump is a polarizing figure. People either love him or hate him. And so it's very important that you try to be as neutral and unbiased as possible. And all I could think about was that quote of the day from Walter Lippmann, show me a man who says he's objective, and I'll show you a man who's deceiving himself. Well, in any event, I was like, wow, this is going to be really tough. But I appeared, and in fact, I'm in such a good mood. What I'll do is I'll even put up for you my link to the broadcast. I have it if you want to watch it. But I want to tell you what happened, and you could decide for yourself if you noticed anything. But let me tell you what happened. I do the news spots. I'm on, I do. In total, I was speaking for about 20 minutes at different points in the broadcast, and I go into work the next day. I check my email, and a couple of my colleagues who are big Donald Trump supporters wrote to me, "I saw you on TV," and I'm like, "Oh no." I'm saying, I bet my bias against him really showed. And they wrote instead, check this out, they thanked me for being so unbiased and objective in my analysis. And then I realized that bias did have an effect on me. I was so concerned that I would sound too anti-Trump that maybe I sounded too pro-Trump as a way to compensate for people thinking that I was too anti-Trump. So in a very subtle way, you can see how bias can also operate. And I bet you have this in your own lives, right? It's kind of like your best friend has a new special someone in their lives who you really don't like. But what you do is whenever you see them together, you act like extra nice because you don't want your friend to know how much you hate their guts because you're biased against them. See the idea? So I think maybe that's what I ended up doing. So there we have Howard Zinn, Daniel Boorstin, Dr. Klein, the very important issue of bias. You know what this means. It's time for our reflection questions. And, of course, our last magic number. I can't remember if I gave you the second magic number. I know I gave you the first one. So our second magic number, just in case you know what the first one is, our second magic number is the number 24. The second magic number is 24. Now we'll go to our reflection questions. Okay, here are our reflection questions, and here you can choose one. I'll give you like a minimum to do one, but if you want to do both, feel free. So remember, I know the question, so what you need to do is you need to write the answer to this question. In our analysis of historical bias, we learned how Daniel Boorstin's and to a lesser extent Howard Zinn's later actions were an attempt to compensate for what they felt were their sins of the past. With this in mind, discuss someone you know personally, no famous people, who engaged in the same type of pattern of behavior. Be sure to explain what they made them compensate for their past and evaluate if you think this decision was a wise one. If you think if this pattern applies to you, you can use yourself as an example. And by the way, now our final magic number of the day is the number 22. 22 is the final magic number of the day. Final magic number of the day, and ding, ding, ding. Little bonus opportunity, little half-point bonus. The numbers that I gave you actually form the birthday of a famous American that has been the subject at some point in our classes over these weeks of someone we've actually discussed. Who is that person? So you could do that question, or you could do this one. Given that we are all biased to some extent, describe an episode in your life where you felt that you treated someone terribly unfairly because of your bias towards them. In other words, that you already had a predisposition against them. Okay? Or a situation, or because of a situation, right? Or a situation where you were treated terribly unfairly because of someone else's bias towards you. So, with that said, we have reached the end of this asynchronous lecture of Klein Time. And remember, as always, Klein Time is always your time to shine. Look forward to you incorporating this lecture into your lecture notes. Because after all, you will be submitting them as part of your lecture note assignment. In this case, it should be for, it depends on whether or not you're in my 19th or 20th century class. So I will indicate to you which lecture note assignment I want this to apply for you. Anyhow, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.